Well, happy Holy Week, everyone. Today is Good Friday as we look at what happened on this day in history. So just to recap, remember that late last night, Thursday night, and really early this morning, Friday morning, Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was taken before the Jewish council, and while he was being questioned and mistreated, Peter was right outside in the courtyard and ended up denying Jesus 3 times. And then he ran away and wept for a long time, because this is exactly what Jesus prophesied. Jesus told him whenever they were having dinner, Peter, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter was all like, no, I would never. I would give my life for you. Well, that's exactly what happened. Peter knew that what he did was wrong, and so he ran away and wept. And so this trial had gone on all throughout the night. Now, none of these people, this is what we see, none of these people then have slept. And I know you probably know how you are when you don't get a lot of sleep, when you miss out on sleep. You know, the smallest thing can frustrate you. Well, these people got angry at everything, literally everything going on. So this is what happened on Good Friday, today, early this morning. Matthew 27, verse 1. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him, and they led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. So when it was morning, all of the essential government personnel were at their stations and in their offices. And so they took Jesus to Pilate. Pilate was the one who had authority to put people to death. And so that's where they went. They took him straight to the governor. Matthew 27, verse 3 says this: Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, saw that the council had condemned him to death, and that was their determination, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. Like, so, go handle this yourself, according to your own conscience. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and he hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it is blood money. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord had directed them. So, like Peter, Judas was most likely with this large crowd that had gathered around Jesus early this morning. And when he saw that the Jewish council had determined to put Jesus to death, probably seeing what he had done, what was happening, and being filled with emotion and regret, he tried to give the money back, the 30 pieces of silver, but they wouldn't take it. And so, just still filled with regret, he threw the money down, ran away, and he hung himself. So Judas is no more at this time. And they said that this wasn't lawful for them to put the money back into the treasury. I just want to point out that none of this was lawful. So Jesus had earlier called them all hypocrites, and they're showing that they are hypocrites. They're going against the law by having this trial at night, by executing Jesus, who's innocent. They can't prove anything. They're bringing false witnesses against him in order to have some sort of charge against him. They're lying to Pilate about him, as we'll see in a few moments. And yet, whenever it comes to the money that was returned, they say, oh, it's not lawful for us to put it in the treasury. Let's do something else with it. None of this, what they were doing, was lawful. So they are acting as hypocrites at this point. But also, this was all to fulfill a prophecy in the Old Testament. Again, this is not according to their timeline. This is not according to their agenda. This is all according to God's agenda and his timeline and his orchestration. God has ordained this moment to happen for the good of mankind. And that is why we call it Good Friday, because if Jesus did not die for our sins, if there was no sacrifice that God offered, then none of us would be able to live. None of us would be able to have salvation and experience abundant life with God. And so in Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 16, this is what happened. They took him to Pilate. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Remember, Jesus didn't say that. Jesus asked for the denarius, and he said, "Whose inscription is this?" And they said, "It's Caesar's." And Jesus said, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." They're saying, though, that Jesus has said, "Don't pay taxes to Caesar." And that's not true at all. They're lying about him. Verse 3, and Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." And when Pilate heard this, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other on that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." Jesus was given to Pilate, who tried to dance around the situation and get rid of this whole thing, this whole riot that was brewing up. So he sent Jesus to Herod. He's like, he's under Herod's jurisdiction, so I don't have to deal with it this morning. And Herod was really excited at first, but then Jesus never spoke up. He never actually communicated with Herod. And so Herod sent him back to Pilate. Herod didn't want to deal with it either. And so now it's Pilate's problem. He's the governor, and he has to deal with the situation. So after Pilate then had Jesus whipped, he tried to, again, dance around the issue and distract the people. So he brought out a man named Barabbas. And this Barabbas character was the worst of the worst. In the book of Luke, chapter 23, it calls Barabbas a murderer. He has stirred up the people, an insurrection of the people, and has actually murdered at least one person. But in Matthew 27, verse 15, it says this. Verse 15. Now at the feast, the governor, that's Pilate, was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" So we have this notorious murderer, insurrectionist, this very bad guy, the worst of the worst, or we have Jesus, which is not guilty. He's innocent. There's no crime or charge really against him. For Pilate knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas, the worst of the worst, and destroy Jesus. Not just kill him, destroy him, completely remove him from this earth. The governor again said to them, Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children," which was a true statement. Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. So Jesus was officially handed over at this point. He was mocked, beaten, spit upon. He received a crown of thorns that pierced through his scalp. And by noon, as we read through on in the next part of the book of Matthew, by noon, Jesus was on the cross. And around 3, he had officially laid down his life. He yielded up his spirit to God, and he died at around 3 p.m. And Luke tells us that the Sabbath was about to begin. So we have the Sabbath would begin about 6 p.m. So we have from 3 to 6. So there's about 3 hours when Jesus needs to be taken down from the cross and placed in a grave, placed in a tomb, because they couldn't do any work on the Sabbath. And so there was actually, they were hurrying to do all of this. And so that's why we see then on resurrection morning, when the women come to the tomb in order to prepare the body to with spices and different things, they weren't able to do that because there wasn't enough time going on Friday when Jesus was taken down from the cross and then placed in the tomb. And so if you want to read more about that, that is Matthew chapter 27, verses 32 through 61. And that is Good Friday. Happy Holy Week, everyone.